the next few weeks, we will be diving into the history of Egypt. Here is the full article, Part 8. Islamic Egypt, the Early Dynasties, 639 CE, 1969 CE. The history of Islamic rule in Egypt prior to the Ottoman conquest is not merely a tale of changing governors. It is the chronicle of a massive geopolitical pivot. Over the course of 3 centuries, Egypt transitioned from a heavily exploited, culturally alienated border province of the Byzantine Empire into the beating heart of the Islamic world. This era witnessed a profound, agonizing, and ultimately absolute shift in language, religion, and urban geography, laying the complex groundwork for the great medieval sultanates that would follow. The Rashidun era and the Arab conquest, 639-658 CE. By the second decade of the 7th century, the Byzantine province of Egypt was economically depleted and spiritually fractured. Decades of seesawing, apocalyptic warfare between the Byzantine Empire and Sassanid Persia had left the eastern Mediterranean in ruins. Furthermore, the Byzantine imperial court in Constantinople was obsessed with enforcing theological uniformity. Their attempts to rigidly impose the Chalcedonian doctrine, the belief in the dual nature of Christ, upon the native Coptic population, who fiercely adhered to the Miaphysite doctrine, the belief in a single, united nature of Christ, had deeply alienated local elites and the rural peasantry. Heavy taxation, religious persecution under the ruthless Byzantine Patriarch Cyrus of Phasis, and endless military requisitions made the Byzantine state deeply unpopular outside the Hellenized, Greek-speaking enclaves of Alexandria. Into this fractured landscape rode the armies of the newly established Rashidun Caliphate. Under the authority of the second Caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, the brilliant Arab ibn al-As led a highly mobile, battle-hardened force of roughly 4,000 Bedouin cavalrymen across the Sinai Peninsula in December 1639 CE. Local resistance was highly uneven. While Byzantine garrisons fought fiercely in fortified positions, the vast Coptic peasantry, deeply resentful of Constantinople's religious and financial oppression, offered little support to the imperial defense. The conquest was a masterclass in mobility and psychological warfare. An bypassed the heavily fortified coastal roads and struck inland, laying siege to the eastern delta gateway of Pelusium, which fell after a grueling month. He then pushed southward to Bilbais, securing the desert flanks. The decisive field engagement occurred in July 640 CE at the Battle of Heliopolis. Reinforced by an additional 8,000 men sent by the Caliph, Amr faced a massive Byzantine army commanded by the general Theodore. Through superior mobility, brilliant cavalry flanking maneuvers, and the sheer combat exhaustion of the heavily armored Byzantine troops, the smaller Arab force utterly shattered the imperial army. Amr then marched on the strategic linchpin of Egypt, the colossal Roman fortress of Babylon located in modern Old Cairo. The siege of Babylon lasted 7 brutal months. Inside the impregnable walls, the Byzantine prefect and patriarch Cyrus, known in Arab chronicles as Al-Muqawqis, desperately tried to negotiate a truce. But his efforts were repeatedly sabotaged by hardline commanders and the Emperor Heraclius in Constantinople. However, in February 641 CE, Heraclius died. The news threw the Byzantine court into a chaotic succession crisis, paralyzing any hope of a relief fleet. Demoralized and ravaged by disease, the Babylon garrison surrendered in April 1641 CE. With the apex of the Delta secured, Amr's forces marched on Alexandria. Recognizing that a protracted siege of the heavily fortified sea-supplied city could take years, Amr engaged in high-level diplomacy. The Byzantine elites, aware that they were entirely cut off from the empire, opted for survival. In October 61 CE, they signed the Pact of Alexandria, effective 62 CE. The terms guaranteed the Coptic population absolute religious freedom, the autonomy of their churches, and the safe return of their exiled patriarch Benjamin I. In exchange, the non-Muslim population was required to pay a poll tax, the jizya, and a land tax, the kharaj. The Byzantine military elites and wealthy Greek citizens were given a grace period to evacuate the city by sea, taking their movable wealth with them. Rather than ruling from the Hellenistic coastal metropolis of Alexandria, which remained highly vulnerable to Byzantine naval counterattacks, Amr made a strategic pivot inward. He pitched his tent near the captured fortress of Babylon and founded a new administrative garrison city, Fustat, from the Roman Phaseton, meaning entrenched camp. Fustat was organized into tribal quarters, kittas, where the conquering Arab armies settled. At its center, Amr constructed the Mosque of Amr ibn al-As in 642 CE, the first mosque in Africa, which served as the spiritual and political form of the new capital. The Umayyad Caliphate 661-750 CE, the granary of Damascus. Following the assassination of Caliph Ali and the end of the Rashidun era, the Umayyad dynasty seized power, shifting the capital of the Islamic world to Damascus in Syria. Under the Umayyads, Egypt functioned strictly as a highly lucrative, tightly controlled extraction province. The primary geopolitical function of Egypt was to feed the expanding Islamic Empire and fund its endless wars of expansion across North Africa, the Maghreb, and into the Iberian Peninsula. To facilitate this, the Umayyad governors reopened the ancient Canal of the Pharaohs, renamed the Canal of the Commander of the Faithful, which linked the Nile directly to the Red Sea. This allowed Egyptian grain to be shipped directly to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina and the Hijaz, preventing famine in the Arabian Peninsula. Early Islamic administration in Egypt was highly pragmatic. Because the Arab ruling elite formed a tiny minority, they relied heavily on existing provincial structures. Coptic and Greek scribes were retained to maintain the intricate land registers, manage the irrigation networks, and collect taxes. The local administration was left in the hands of Coptic patriarchs, district administrators. For the average Falah peasant, the change in regime simply meant that their taxes were forwarded to Fustat and Damascus instead of Alexandria and Constantinople. However, as the Umayyad state expanded, its financial needs skyrocketed. Governors appointed from Syria were heavily pressured to maximize tax revenues, leading to widespread corruption and the aggressive taxation of Christian monks who had previously been exempt. Furthermore, the Umayyads began settling loyal Arab tribes in the eastern delta to secure the province and break the demographic monopoly of the Copts. This aggressive fiscal policy triggered massive social unrest. In 725 CE, the first of the great Bashmoruk revolts erupted in the marshlands of the northern delta. The Copts, infuriated by extortionate taxation and the arrogance of the newly settled Arab tribes, launched a bloody decentralized guerrilla war against the Umayyad tax collectors. The revolt was brutally crushed, but it set a precedent of native resistance that would plague the Arab governors for the next century. During this period, the Islamization of Egypt was incredibly slow. The Umayyads generally discouraged mass conversion because it would deplete the jizya revenue base. Greek and Coptic remained widely used in official state documents, resulting in a complex layered bureaucracy where bilingual papyri were the norm. It was not until the reign of the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik in the late 7th century that Arabic was decreed the sole official language of the state, beginning the slow decline of Greek in the administrative spheres. The early Abbasid era, 750–868 CE, rebellion and turmoil. In 750 CE, the Abbasid revolution violently swept across the Islamic world, obliterating the Umayyad dynasty. The final Umayyad Caliph, Marwan II, fled to Egypt in a desperate bid to rally support, but he was hunted down and killed by Abbasid forces in the Fayum, marking the definitive end of the Umayyad era. The Abbasids shifted the imperial capital far to the east, founding the magnificent city of Baghdad in Iraq. For Egypt, this geographic shift was profound. The province was no longer adjacent to the imperial center in Syria. It was now a distant, wealthy outpost treated largely as a cash cow. To signify a break from the Umayyad past, the Abbasid governors founded a new administrative capital adjacent to Fustat, named Al-Aska, the cantonment, complete with a new governor's palace and congregational mosque. Abbasid rule in Egypt was characterized by intense instability. The governor sent from Baghdad rarely lasted more than a year or two before being recalled or assassinated, creating a chaotic political vacuum. The Abbasid tax policies were even more relentless than those of their predecessors. By 831 CE, the boiling frustrations of the native population culminated in the final, most devastating Bashmoruk revolt. Uniquely, this rebellion united the oppressed Coptic peasantry with disgruntled Arab settlers in the delta, both of whom were being crushed by the Baghdad-appointed tax farmers. The revolt was so severe that the Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun personally traveled to Egypt with a massive army of heavily armed Turkic cavalry to suppress it in 1832 CE. The rebellion was crushed with apocalyptic violence. Villages were burned to the ground, mass executions were carried out, and thousands of Copts were enslaved or deported to Iraq. This brutal pacification marked the demographic turning point in Egyptian history. The destruction of the Coptic resistance broke the political power of the native Christians forever. From the mid-9th century onward, a combination of crushing tax incentives, social mobility pressures, and intermarriage led to a rapid acceleration of conversions to Islam. Furthermore, the arrival of massive Turkic military regiments altered the ethnic makeup of the ruling class, deeply estranging the local population from their foreign overlords. The Tulunid Enrit 1868–905 CE, Egypt's first golden age. The sheer logistical difficulty of governing such a wealthy, distant province from Iraq inevitably encouraged the rise of autonomous dynasties. The first major break from direct Abbasid control came with Ahmad ibn Tulun. Ibn Tulun was a Turkic military slave, a ghulam, who had been raised as a hostage in the Abbasid court at Samarra. Known for his brilliant intellect, administrative genius, and fierce martial prowess, he was appointed resident governor of Egypt in 1868 CE. Recognizing the terminal decline of Abbasid authority in Baghdad, which was crippled by the Zonj rebellion and internal Turkic military coups, Ibn Tulun methodically transformed his governorship into a fully independent hereditary emirate. His first masterstroke was financial. He simply refused to forward Egypt's immense annual tax revenues to Baghdad. With this staggering wealth kept entirely within Egypt's borders, Ibn Tulun initiated an economic and architectural renaissance. He constructed a massive new royal city north of Fustat and Al-Askar, named Al-Kate the Wards. Modeled heavily on the imperial grandeur of Samarra, Al-Kate featured vast public squares, sweeping palaces, and a legendary Bimaristan hospital that provided free medical care to all citizens, financed entirely by state endowments. The crown jewel of his capital was the Mosque of Ahmad ibn Tulun, completed in 1879 CE. It remains one of the oldest and most magnificent congregational mosques in the world, renowned for its massive brick piers, intricate stucco carvings, and its unique spiral minaret, heavily influenced by Mesopotamian architecture. Economically, the Tulunid era was a boon to Ibn Tulun invested heavily in repairing the ancient milometer on Rhoda Island to accurately measure the floods and assess fair taxation, and he launched massive public works projects to repair the delta's decrepit irrigation canals. Militarily, he forged a massive, fiercely loyal local army composed of tens of thousands of Turkic, Greek, and Sudanese slaves. With this force, he expanded Egypt's borders, successfully invading Syria and the Levant, creating an Egyptian empire that directly rivaled Baghdad. However, the Tulunid Golden Age was short-lived. Following Ahmad's death, his son Kumarway inherited the throne. While Kumarway successfully defended Egypt militarily, he was notoriously extravagant, bankrupting the state treasury with absurd luxuries, including a palace featuring a pool filled with liquid mercury. After his assassination by his own eunuchs in 1896 CE, the dynasty fell into chaotic infighting. Capitalizing on this weakness, the Abbasids sent a massive invasion force in 1905 CE. They captured Egypt, burned the beautiful city of El-Khatai to the ground, sparing only the great mosque, and dragged the province back under the direct, suffocating rule of Baghdad. The Ikhshidid dynasty 935,969 CE, the anarchic interlude, the Abbasid restoration in Egypt was a disaster. The next 30 years were marked by spectacular corruption, military mutinies, devastating loan Niles, and terrifying incursions from the west by the newly risen Fatimid Caliphate in North Africa. The Abbasid state was financially ruined and utterly incapable of maintaining order. In 1935 CE, Baghdad appointed another powerful Turkic commander, Muhammad ibn Tubi, as governor, hoping he could stabilize the bleeding province. Claiming royal descent from the ancient kings of Fergana and Central Asia, Ibn Tubi was granted the prestigious Persian title al-Ikhshid, meaning prince or king, by the Abbasid caliph. Like Ibn Tulun before him, the Ikhshid quickly realized that relying on Baghdad was pointless. He ruthlessly crushed local rebellions, violently repelled the Fatimid invasions from the Maghreb, and seized control of Syria and the Hijaz, carving out a new, fiercely independent Egyptian state. The Ikhshidid military machine was heavily reliant on an army of over 400,000 Turkic and black African slave soldiers. The most fascinating figure of the Ikhshidid era was not a king, but a slave. Following the death of Muhammad ibn Tuji, real power fell into the hands of Abu al-Miskafor, an Abyssinian Ethiopian eunuch who had been purchased as a young boy. Khufu rose through the military ranks to become the supreme commander of the army, and the tutor to the Ikhshid's young sons. For 22 years, Khufu ruled Egypt as the de facto sovereign with an iron fist and brilliant political cunning. He was a lavish patron of the arts, most famously hosting the legendary Arab poet al-Mutanabi at his court, though their relationship eventually soured, leading to al-Mutanabi writing vicious and mortal satires against him. Despite Khufu's competence, the foundations of the Ikhshidid state were rotting. The economy was heavily reliant on military extortion, and the agricultural system was collapsing due to state neglect. When Kafur died in 1968 CE, Egypt was struck by a series of catastrophic low Niles, triggering mass famine, hyperinflation, and horrifying outbreaks of plague. The Ikhshidid army, unpaid and starving, splintered into warring factions, looting Fustat and abandoning the frontiers. The Egyptian state was paralyzed, its people starving, and its military in ruins. Across the western desert in modern-day Tunisia, the Fatimid Caliphate watched this collapse with predatory anticipation. The stage was perfectly set for the greatest invasion in medieval Egyptian history. Islamic Egypt, the imperial sultanates 1969 CE, 1517 CE. This second half of Egypt's medieval history chronicles the province's absolute ascent to the center of the global Islamic stage. Following the collapse of Abbasid authority and the chaotic interlude of the Ikhshidids, Egypt was conquered by successive waves of magnificent, highly militarized dynasties. Under the Fatimids, Ayyubids, and Mamluks, Egypt not only repelled existential threats from European crusaders and Asian Mongols, but also birthed an unparalleled era of monumental architecture, booming global trade, and intense theological scholarship that forever defined the skyline and soul of Cairo. The Fatimid Caliphate, 1969, 1171 CE, the Shia Golden Age. In 1969 CE, the starving, politically shattered remnants of the Ikhshidid state watched helplessly as a massive, highly disciplined army marched out of the Western Desert. This was the army of the Fatimid Caliphate, an Ismaili Shia dynasty that had originated in Ifriqiya, modern Tunisia. Claiming direct holy descent from the Prophet Muhammad's daughter Fatima and his cousin Ali, the Fatimids represented a profound ideological and political challenge to the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. Led by the brilliant general Jawhar al-Sakili, Jawhar the Sicilian, the Fatimid forces entered Fustat with virtually no resistance. Jawhar immediately negotiated a peace treaty with the exhausted urban notables, guaranteeing their safety, religious freedom, and the restoration of the collapsing food supply. The birth of Cairo and Al-Azhar. To assert their absolute imperial supremacy, the Fatimids refused to rule from the old Sunni administrative centers of Fustat or Al-Askar. Instead, Jawhar marched his troops a few miles north and laid the foundations for a spectacular new royal enclosure. According to legend, the foundation lines were drawn while the planet Mars Al-Khater was ascending. Thus, the city was named Al-Qaira, Cairo, the victorious. Initially, Cairo was not a city for the masses. It was a heavily fortified, forbidden palace complex housing the caliph, his vast harem, the treasury, and the elite military guards. The native Egyptians continued to live, work, and trade in the sprawling, bustling metropolis of Fustat to the south. To serve as the spiritual heart of their new capital and a training ground for Ismaili missionaries' dies, the Fatimids immediately began construction on the Al-Azhar Mosque, completed in 1972 CE. While intended to spread Shia doctrine, Al-Azhar would eventually outlive its founders to become one of the oldest and most prestigious Sunni Islamic universities in the world. The cosmopolitan economy and pragmatic tolerance. In 1973 CE, the Fatimid Caliph Al-Mu'izz-Din Allah officially transferred his court from North Africa to Cairo, bringing with him the coffins of his ancestors and immense wealth. Under Al-Mu'izz and his successor Al-Aziz, Egypt entered a staggering economic golden age. The Fatimids capitalized on the shifting dynamics of global trade. As the Persian Gulf route became unstable due to Abbasid decline, the Fatimids redirected the hyper-lucrative Indian Ocean spice trade through the Red Sea. Spices, silks, and pearls from India and Indonesia flowed into Egyptian ports like Aydab, traveled overland to the Nile, and were sold in the markets of Fustat to Byzantine and Italian merchants. Because the Fatimid elite were a Shia minority ruling over a massive Sunni and Coptic Christian majority, they adopted a policy of highly pragmatic cosmopolitan tolerance. They heavily promoted meritocracy over religious affiliation. A prime example was Yaqub bin Kilis, a brilliantly capable Jewish convert to Islam who served as the Fatimid vizier, entirely restructuring the state's tax system and currency, making the Fatimid gold dinar the standard currency of the Mediterranean. Coptic Christians dominated the state bureaucracy and the medical professions, and Jewish merchants the Radhanites first in the global transit trade. The enigma of al-Hakim and the slow decline. This era of enlightened tolerance was brutally interrupted by the reign of al-Hakim by Amr Allah in 996-1021 CE. Ascending to the throne as a child, al-Hakim grew into a highly erratic, terrifying ruler. He issued increasingly bizarre edicts, banning the making of women's shoes to keep them indoors, ordering all dogs in Cairo killed, and forcing Christians and Jews to wear heavy wooden crosses or bills around their necks. Most devastatingly, in 1009 CE, he ordered the total destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, an act that sent shockwaves through Christendom and helped lay the psychological groundwork for the First Crusade. Al-Hakim eventually vanished during a night ride in the Mokattam Hills in 1021 CE, leaving behind a splinter sect that revered him as a divine manifestation, the modern-day Druze. Following al-Hakim, the Fatimid state began a long, agonizing structural decline. The caliphs retreated into their palaces, becoming figureheads, while real power was violently contested by military viziers. The multi-ethnic army, composed of heavily armored Berber cavalry, Turkic archers, and Sudanese infantry, frequently turned the streets of Cairo into a bloodbath of factional warfare. This political rot culminated in the apocalyptic Mustansiriya crisis 1065-1072 CE during the reign of Caliph al-Mustansir. A 7-year failure of the Nile flood, combined with military looting, triggered a famine so severe that chroniclers report the desperate populace resorting to cannibalism, eating the dogs, cats, and eventually each other. The crisis was only ended when the ruthless Armenian general Badr al-Jamali was invited into Cairo, executing the warring emirs, rebuilding the city's massive stone gates, Bab al-Futu, Bab al-Nasr, and Bab Zuela, and ruling as a military dictator. From this point on, the Fatimid caliphs were essentially prisoners of their own viziers. The Ayyubid dynasty, 1171-1250 CE, jihad in the Sunni restoration. By the 1160s, the decaying Fatimid state was caught in a geopolitical vice. The aggressively expanding Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem under King Amalric and the Sunni Zengid dynasty of Syria under Nur al-Din both recognized that whoever controlled the limitless agricultural wealth of Egypt would control the Middle East. After a series of complex three-way proxy wars, Nur al-Din's Kurdish general Shirkuh seized control of Cairo in 1169 CE. When Shirkuh died weeks later, his young, highly ambitious nephew was appointed vizier. His name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the west as Saladin. The end of the Fatimids and the Sunni revival. Saladin moved with brilliant, calculated caution.
As vizier to the dying Fatimid Caliph al-Adid, he systematically purged Ismaili loyalists from the military and replaced the Sudanese Guard with his own loyal Kurdish and Turkic troops.
When al-Adid died in 1171 CE, Saladin formally abolished the 200-year-old Fatimid Caliphate, instantly restoring Egypt's nominal allegiance to the Sunni Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. In reality, he founded his own empire, the Ayyubid dynasty. Saladin immediately initiated a massive ideological project, the Sunni restoration. He stripped Al-Azhar of its prestigious status and seized Fatimid palaces, transforming them into Sunni madrasas, colleges of Islamic law. He heavily sponsored the Shafi'i school of jurisprudence, importing Sunni scholars from Syria and Iraq to re-educate the Egyptian populace and stamp out the last vestiges of Shia thought. Recognizing that Cairo was highly vulnerable, Saladin initiated the greatest military engineering project since the Romans. He ordered the construction of the citadel of Cairo, Qala al-Din, on the high rocky spur of the Mokattam Hills. He also began building a massive unified stone wall intended to enclose both the royal enclosure of Cairo and the commercial hub of Fustat into one impregnable fortress. The epicenter of the Crusades under Saladin, Egypt became the geopolitical and economic engine driving the global war against the Crusaders. By 1186 CE, Saladin had successfully united Egypt, Syria, and parts of Mesopotamia into a single, massive Islamic front. In 1187 CE, this strategy bore fruit. He shattered the Crusader field army at the Battle of Hattin and triumphantly recaptured the holy city of Jerusalem. This victory cemented Saladin's legacy, but it also painted a massive target on Egypt's back. European monarchs realized that Jerusalem could never be securely held as long as the Egyptian war machine remained intact. Consequently, the later Crusades bypassed the Levant entirely and aimed straight for the Nile Delta. During the Fifth Crusade 1218-1221 CE and the Seventh Crusade 1249-1250 CE, massive European armadas landed in Egypt and captured the strategic port of Damietta. Both invasions ultimately drowned in the complex, waterlogged geography of the Delta. The Seventh Crusade, led by King Louis IX of France, was a particularly spectacular disaster. The French army became bogged down in the flooded canals near Mansour, was decimated by disease and Egyptian counterattacks, and was ultimately forced to surrender, with the French king himself taken prisoner and ransomed for a staggering sum of gold. The seeds of destruction, the Mamluk system, to fight these endless grinding holy wars, the later Ayyubid sultans, particularly as Salih Ayyub, changed the nature of the Egyptian military. Distrustful of his treacherous Kurdish and Ayyubid relatives, Salih purchased thousands of Kipchak Turkic slave boys from the Eurasian steppes. These slaves, known as Mamluks, literally those who were owned, were converted to Islam, housed in barracks on Rhoda Island in the Nile, giving them the name de Bahriya, or River Regiment, and trained rigorously in elite cavalry tactics. This created a fiercely loyal, heavily armored, and highly lethal military caste. However, during the chaos of the Seventh Crusade in 1249 CE, Sultan Ali died of gangrene in his camp. His brilliant widow, Shajar al-Dur, secretly concealed his death to prevent the army from panicking, successfully managing the defeat of the French. When Asali's arrogant son, Turan Shah, finally arrived to claim the throne and foolishly threatened the elite Bahriya Mamluks, they murdered him in cold blood. In 1250 CE, Shahar al-Dur temporarily ruled as Sultana, a highly unique event in Islamic history. Before marrying the Mamluk commander Aybak, the Ayyubid bloodline was violently severed. The slaves had become the masters. The Mamluk Sultanate, 1250-1517 CE, the martial Renaissance, the The Mamluk Sultanate was one of the most unique, paradoxical, and spectacular political systems in human history. It was a military aristocracy composed entirely of foreign-born slaves. Because they were legally purchased property, the system was fiercely non-hereditary. A powerful Mamluk emir's son, the Awlad al-Nas, was born a free Muslim and was therefore generally prohibited from entering the elite ranks of the royal cavalry. To maintain their numbers, the Mamluk state had to constantly import thousands of new slave boys from the Black Sea, the Caucasus, and the Golden Horde. This created an incredibly ruthless meritocratic environment. Every sultan was a man who had started as a purchased slave, survived brutal military training, and climbed the bloody ladder of factional politics to the throne. The era is generally divided into two periods based on the ethnic origins of the dominant regiments: the Turkic-Bahri Mamluks 1250-1382 CE, and the Circassian Burji Mamluks 1382-1517 CE. Saviors of the Islamic world, Ain Jalut and Akbar, the Mamluks ascended to power, darkest hour in Islamic history. Okay, I understand what the right word does when you look at it. In 1258 CE, the apocalyptic Mongol Empire, led by Hulagu Khan, sacked Baghdad, executed the Abbasid Caliph, and effectively annihilated the center of the Islamic world.
In 1260 CE, the Mongol horde advanced into Syria, sending arrogant demands for Egypt's immediate surrender. The Mamluk Sultan Qutuz, alongside his brilliant and utterly ruthless general Baybars, chose to fight.
They marched the Egyptian army out of the continent and met the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath in Palestine. Utilizing feigned retreats and devastating heavy cavalry charges, the Mamluks achieved the impossible. They decisively crushed the Mongol army. Ain Jalut was a world historical turning point that permanently halted the westward expansion of the Mongols and saved Egypt and North Africa from total destruction. On the march back to Cairo, Baybars assassinated Qutuz and seized the throne. Sultan Baybars ruled 1267-127 CE, became the true architect of the Mamluk Empire. He ruthlessly consolidated power, rebuilt the Egyptian navy, and launched a massive systemic jihad against the remaining Crusader states. His campaigns, later finished by Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, culminated in the terrifying siege and destruction of Acre in 1291 CE, permanently driving the Crusaders out of the Levant and ending a 200-year European presence in the Middle East.
The imperial metropolis, trade, piety, and architecture. To legitimize their usurpation of the throne, the Mamluks invited a surviving member of the Abbasid family to Cairo, installing him as a shadow caliph.
While the caliph was essentially a well-dressed prisoner with zero political power, his presence, combined with Mamluk military control over the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, cemented Cairo as the undisputed religious and political capital of the Islamic world. Economically, the Mamluks were fabulously wealthy. They institutionalized a state monopoly over the transit trade. Spices from India arrived in the Red Sea, were taxed exorbitantly by the Mamluk Karami merchants, and sold to Venetian and Genoese traders in the port of Alexandria. This immense wealth was pumped directly into the urban fabric of Cairo.
Because Mamluk wealth could not be legally passed to their sons, the emirs utilized Islamic trust laws, al-Qaf, to build monumental tax-exempt pious foundations. The Mamluk skyline exploded with breathtaking architecture.
Sultans like Kelowan built massive hospital complexes, Maristans, that offered free, state-of-the-art medical care to the public. Sultan Hassan constructed a gargantuan mosque and madrasa complex that remains one of the largest in the world, serving as a fortress during urban civil wars. The Mamluks pioneered distinct architectural features: soaring, intricately carved stone domes covering magnificent mausoleums, dizzyingly complex Muqarnas stalactite vaulting, and soaring minarets that dominated the desert horizon. Religious life thrived. Sunni scholarship reached a golden age, with luminaries like the historian al-Makrizi and the polymath Ibn Khaldun writing in the shadow of Al-Azhar. Sufism, Islamic mysticism, became deeply embedded in society, with the state building massive khanqahs, Sufi lodges where mystics engaged in ecstatic chanting dhikr to achieve spiritual union with God. The Black Death and the Ottoman eclipse. Despite its martial brilliance and architectural splendor, the Mamluk system possessed fatal structural flaws. The state was highly decentralized, relying on the IKTA system, where military commanders exploited agricultural land to fund their private armies. This led to chronic instability. The average Mamluk sultan ruled for only a few years before being poisoned, overthrown, or murdered in a coup. In 1347 CE, the ultimate catastrophe arrived on merchant ships in Alexandria, the Black Death. The bubonic plague decimated Egypt, killing an estimated 40% of the population. The demographic collapse was so severe that agriculture ground to a halt. The irrigation canals silted up from lack of labor, and state revenues plummeted. Because the Mamluk elite still had to purchase highly expensive foreign slaves to maintain their military, they compensated for the lost tax revenue by violently extorting the merchant class, further suffocating the economy. The final fatal blow was technological and geographical. Throughout the 15th century, the conservative Mamluk cavalry, deeply proud of their martial arts with the bow, lance, and sword, stubbornly refused to adopt the widespread use of firearms and field artillery, viewing gunpowder as a cowardly weapon fit only for infantry. Simultaneously, in 1498 CE, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama successfully rounded the Cape of Good Hope, establishing a direct naval route to India. The Portuguese swiftly militarized the Indian Ocean, bypassing the Red Sea entirely and permanently shattering the Mamluk spice monopoly. Bankrupt, decimated by plague, and technologically obsolete, the Mamluk Sultanate faced the rising superpower of the north, the Ottoman Empire. In 1516 CE, at the Battle of Mars-Dabik in Syria, the Ottoman Sultan Selim I unleashed his terrifying ranks of musket-wielding janissaries and massive field artillery upon the charging Mamluk cavalry. The Mamluks were slaughtered. The following year, at the Battle of Rudania 1517 CE outside Cairo, the final Mamluk Sultan Tuman Bey was defeated and later hanged from the massive iron gates of Bab's Whale. Egypt, the proud independent center of the Islamic world, was formally annexed. It became once again a province of a distant empire ruled from Istanbul. Yet the Mamluks themselves were not exterminated. They were retained by the Ottomans as a powerful local ruling caste, ensuring that the fierce, deeply ingrained cultural and political legacy of Islamic Egypt's greatest dynasties would endure for centuries to come. Next, we will be exploring Ottoman Egypt, Muhammad Ali, British occupation, and the road to modern Egypt, joined by our resident Egyptian expert. Join us next time on Blind History with Josh.